Students, our today's topic is the development of the tongue. So the development of the tongue in the embryology, it is a complex process that begins during the fourth week of the embryonic development. For the entrance exam, you have to just remember that the tongue formation, it begins during the fourth week of embryonic development. So when does the tongue formation begins? In the fourth week of the embryonic development. Now let us discuss how the tongue development take place. So in the embryonic development, what you will see is the tongue initially it is formed from the tuberculum impar. So what is this tuberculum impar? So the tuberculum impar, it is a median swelling. It is a median swelling that develops on the floor of the primitive pharynx. So what are the structures that develops from the tuberculum impar? The tuberculum impar will give rise to anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So for entrance exam, remember that tuberculum impar will give rise to anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So this tuberculum impar, it is derived from both the embryonic endoderm and the mesoderm. So what you will see, there will be thickening of endoderm lining of the pharynx that occurs at the midline of the developing embryo, just anterior to the first pharyngeal arc. And this thickening is the median endodermal swellings. So the mesodermal tissue that lies beneath the median endodermal swelling will contribute to formation of this tuberculum impar. So the mesodermal cells that are located beneath the median endodermal swellings, they differentiate and give rise to connective tissue, blood vessels and muscles that will support the developing tongue. So over the time, the median endodermal swellings, they expand and elongate, forming the tuberculum impar. On the other hand, we have the two lateral lingual swellings. They also develop on the either side of the tuberculum impar. So these are the two lateral lingual swellings that are present on the both sides. So these swellings will eventually grow, and what they will do is they will fuse with the tuberculum impar and forms the body of the tongue. So the body of tongue is initially small, but it grows rapidly during the fetal development. So what is the function of tuberculum impar? It serves as an important structure in development of tongue, giving rise to anterior 2/3 of the tongue, including the lingual papillae and the taste bud. Now, during the embryonic development, the tongues develop from various structures that are the copula and the hypobranchial eminence. So what is this copula? Copula, it is derived from the mesoderm tissue of the second pharyngeal arch. Whereas the hypobranchial eminence, it is derived from the third and the fourth pharyngeal arches. So the hypobranchial eminence, it has two parts. One is the cranial part and other is the caudal part. So the copula and the hypobranchial eminence, the cranial part, the front part of the hypobranchial eminence and the copula, they initially develop as separate structures, but eventually they will fuse together and they will form the posterior 2/3 of the tongue. So fusion of these structures will give rise to several muscles of the tongue, including styloglossus, hyoglossus, genioglossus, and the intrinsic muscle of the tongue. So remember, the copula, it comes from the tissue called mesoderm in the second pharyngeal arch, while the hypobranchial eminence, it comes from the third and the second pharyngeal arches. So these both fuse together. So remember the glossopharyngeal nerve, a cranial nerve that is responsible for the taste and the sensation in the back of the tongue, is also closely related with this area. So during the embryonic development, the glossopharyngeal nerve, it arrives from the third pharyngeal arch, that also give rise to posterior part of the tongue. As the tongue develops and the different component they fuse together, the glossopharyngeal nerve will become closely associated with the posterior part of tongue, and that is how it innervates this region. So this close association explains why glossopharyngeal nerve it plays an important role in the taste and sensation of the posterior part of the tongue. So during embryonic development, the first arch, remember the first arch will contribute to the anterior one-third of tongue. So the nerves of fibers of the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve here will extend to the tongue and innervate the lingual nerve that provides sensation to the anterior two-thirds of tongue. So the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve will play important role in the development and the body of the tongue that refers to the front two-thirds. It receives its nerve supply from the trigeminal nerve. So the trigeminal nerve, it is the nerve of the first pharyngeal arch, from which the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve arises. The root of tongue, which refer to the back one-third of the tongue, it is supplied by glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve. In the term of the taste sensation, the coda tympani branch of the facial nerve will provide the special sensory innervation to the anterior two-thirds of tongue, and the glossopharyngeal will supply the posterior one-third. The hypoglossal nerve, it supplies the muscle of tongue, including the intrinsic muscle responsible for shaping and the movement, as well as the extrinsic muscles. So these muscles, they are derived from myoblasts that originate in the occipital somites. The hypoglossal nerve that arises from the hypoglossal nuclei in the brainstem, it provides motor innervation to muscle of the tongue. It innervates all the intrinsic, extrinsic muscle of tongue except for the palatoglossus, which is innervated by the vagus nerve. So what you will see, the occipital myotomes will contribute to formation of tongue musculature, while the hypoglossal nerve, it will provide motor innervation necessary for the tongue function. Now, coming back to the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence, as we discussed that the hypobranchial eminence, it has two parts. One is the cranial and the caudal. The caudal part refers to the posterior or back end of the hypobranchial eminence. So the caudal part will give rise to posterior tongue muscle, including styloglossus, hyoglossus. So the epiglottis and the extreme part of the tongue, they are derived from the hypobranchial eminence, from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence. The epiglottis, the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence will give rise to the several structures like the posterior tongue muscles, lingual septum, and posterior tongue muscles, epiglottis, and the lingual septum. So the extreme posterior part of the tongue, which include the area that are known as the tongue base, is also formed from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence. So this region of tongue, it is responsible for function like swelling, speech, production, etc. So the muscles that control the movement of tongue base, they are derived from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence. The superior laryngeal nerve that supply the sensory and motor innervation to larynx also originates from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence. The internal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve also arises from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence and provides sensory sensation to the larynx above the vocal fold. So the epiglottis and extreme posterior part of tongue, they are derived from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence, and they are involved in function like swelling, speech production, and the laryngeal innervation. Let us discuss how the papilla they develop during the embryological phases. The first are the circumvallate papilla. They are formed by the posterior part of the tongue, that is the copula, that arise from the fusion of copula hypobranchial eminence. The circumvallate papilla, they start to develop around 8 weeks of gestation and they are formed by 12 weeks. So remember, for your exam point of view, they are arranged in V-shaped row at the back of tongue. The other are the filiform papilla. They are formed from anterior part of tongue that arise from the lateral lingual swelling. So they are most numerous type of tongue papilla having a pointed conical shape. They develop around 9 weeks of gestation and they are fully formed by 16 weeks. The taste bed that are responsible for detecting different tastes that are located on the tongue papilla. So these taste buds they start to develop from the 7th week of gestation and are fully formed by 16 week. So they arise from specialized cells. They are the taste bud progenitor cells that are derived from the ectoderm. Now let us discuss the arterial supply of the tongue. Initially, during the 4th week of gestation, the blood supply to the developing tongue it is provided by various small vessels that arise from the aortic arch. So these vessels join to form two major arteries that supply the tongue, that is the lingual artery and the maxillary artery. The lingual artery arises from the third aortic arch and supplies the anterior 2/3 of tongue. As the tongue develops, the lingual artery undergoes remodeling and give rise to several branches, including the dorsal lingual artery that supplies the posterior part of the tongue and the deep lingual artery that supplies the tongue musculature and the sublingual gland. The maxillary artery that derives from the first aortic arch give rise to several branches that supply the oral cavity, including the lingual branch. The lingual branch of the maxillary artery will supply the anterior part of tongue, including the lingual papillae and the taste bud. The veins and the lymphatic vessels they develop in the fetal stage of development in a similar process as that of arterial process. So with the vein drainage to the tongue, the smaller veins join to form lingual vein, and these veins drain into the interjugular vein, that is the major vein of the head and neck. The lymph nodes associated with the tongue they are primarily located in the submandibular and the deep cervical region. So the lymphatic vessels of the tongue they are essential for proper functioning of immune system and they play a critical role in defending against infection and the diseases. Other important point is foramen cecum. So it is a depression that is located on the dorsum of the tongue. Located at the junction of anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So during embryonic development, the thyroid gland it begins to form at the base of tongue near the foramen cecum. The thyroglossal duct that connects the thyroid gland to the tongue starts at the foramen cecum and it eventually migrates down to the final location in the neck. So the tuberculum impar is a small elevation on the midline of the tongue located anterior to the foramen cecum. So the foramen cecum it is not essential for normal function of tongue.